I know some of our visitors this evening are thinking, what, a homily at Evensong? And I'm not sure that Sowerby would have seen that in his day, and would have had an opinion about it, I'm sure. And indeed, I do not intend to belabor this. I believe that this evening's proclamation we are receiving mostly from the work of Sowerby and, in fact, the musicians here who are offering it, and we, too, offering our hearts. But while this evening is not the feast of Blessed Leo Sowerby, we are delighted to offer this Evensong in celebration of an extraordinary life and extraordinary works that happened in an extraordinary place here at St. James Cathedral. As a person who's native to Chicago as a young adult, I've heard this name forever, and it is a delight for me to have had this opportunity, perhaps it's the same for you, to learn a little bit more. I do want to thank all those who've made this evening possible. First, Dr. Joseph Sargent, who shared a brilliant lecture immediately before this service, really taking us through some wonderful highlights, and he has published a new biography, or perhaps I believe the first biography of Sowerby, that's what I've read. And I ordered my copy and have been greedily reading my way through it, but it was a wonderful thing to be a part of that lecture. And of course, that leads me to thank the Chicago chapter of the AGO, the American Guild of Organists, for your support of that lecture and for your presence here this night. We are delighted to have the whole community of faith and church music holding up this important person. Next, of course, our brilliant choir, and of course our canon director of music, or as Uncle Leo would apparently prefer to call him, the musical dictator, Stephen Buzard. Not him personally. He just thought the position should be known as the musical dictator. I learned that in my lecture this evening. And his consistent work, Stephen's consistent work, not only in composing this evening's praises and responses, but also his work in bringing the work of Sowerby to the attention and helping to bring it alive, really, for so many people in the broader musical world, but also here in the St. James Cathedral community, recalling and reclaiming the truly inspiring and inspired work of this musical spiritual giant. I will say one of the things I really loved about reading a bit more about Sowerby's life and his career outside of the church is something that I knew at an intuitive level, which is he's a great American composer and a great American sacred music composer. And that is something that I don't know, I've spent a lot of time in the Anglican Communion, very happily so, very much in love with all of the greats from English church music and church choral tradition. But there is something about having someone who so unapologetically adopted and used and refined the American ethos and the American style, and indeed bringing it to life in this place and in this way. And as one who I love so much about our English tradition, but it gives me great joy to hear the American accent in this evening's Mag and Nunc, and to hear the wonderful, that grand, great anthem. So for that I give thanks again for this evening, to be reminded about that great, not only American church music tradition, but indeed the American cathedral tradition. And I think Sowerby, having spent so much time in this place, would be the first to encourage us not to give that up, not to let that slide into some sort of nebulous place, but to claim the American accent, if you will, on the great English cathedral tradition. And so we continue in this great community together, inspired by him and inspired by all that he stood for. And I do believe that he would probably, I think, be okay with us taking liberties with thinking about his music in this way, the American tradition building on the English choral tradition. I, again, learned from my lecture that he was one who was very much about both affirming the classic and the structure, but also allowing for some improvisation. And it sounds like he was so thoroughly an Anglican, so thoroughly an Episcopalian, that he would have probably known by heart the preface to our American prayer book, which says in it, and you can find it in your hymnal racks if you're so inclined, but on page 9 in our prayer book, where the working preface of our prayer book, the American prayer book, is actually the same as the one from the 1662 English Book of Common Prayer. And it goes back further than that. And it says, the Church, having once advisedly established in her articles and homilies, that the Church understands, having once advisedly established these things, that is, it is important that there not be too much stiffness in refusing amendment as arises from our context, and neither should there be too much easiness in admitting variation in things once established. As I know that that's part of so much a deep part of who we are as Anglicans, as Episcopalians, I hear that so clearly in Sowerby's approach to his life's work. It certainly went beyond the church, but his life's work in church and church music. I loved hearing that he indeed affirmed that the church can and does evolve, and the church is a living organism, which is why tonight's celebration feels like a living celebration and not an historical retrospective. Sacred music is meant to be an offering, and where there's an offering to God, it needs to be of the highest quality and highest intent. And so finally we get to the gospel tonight with the Gospel of Luke. And I simply will say, in that we hear Jesus' warning of what it means to hoard and store up treasures on earth where moth and rust decay, but rather not to do that, but to give and give and give again. I understand from his biography that he wasn't very good about holding on to his things, including his musical scores. And so Sowerby was not about building bigger barns to keep everything to himself, but about living a life so fully and giving so fully of himself that he indeed gave so much of it away. So in his story, and of course in the Gospel of Luke, we hear that we are to give and to make of ourselves an offering, to give of ourselves, to give of our lives, to give of our utmost art to the glory of God, and to spend ourselves in the proclamation of the gospel and the good news of Christ's love for the world. Amen.